Every man deserves at least one true friend who believes in him when the whole world has given up. For Eli Hargrove, that friend came with 4 paws and fierce yellow eyes. In Wyoming's dusty, forgotten hills, folks saw him as just another broken-down cowboy, too poor, too soft-hearted, and too stubborn to face reality. When local ranch hands played their cruel joke, giving him a wolf pup instead of the cattle dog he'd saved for months to buy, they expected him to back down and quit. They didn't truly know Eli Hargrove. He raised that wild pup, named her Shadow, and discovered the loyalty no human had ever shown him. But what happens when a corporate giant threatens to destroy his father's sacred land? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Sawtooth Mountains like an old man's whispered prayers, and Eli Hargrove stood on his porch, watching the sun break through with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing never improved anything worth doing. At 53, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd made peace with disappointment, but hadn't surrendered to it. His calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the same one his father had used for 30 years before him, and the steam from his black coffee mixed with the crisp October air. The broken Arrow Ranch spread before him like a faded photograph, its boundaries marked not by the pristine white fencing of the neighboring spreads, but by weathered posts and wire that had seen better decades. What remained of the original 2,000 acres his grandfather had claimed in 1923 now measured just under 300 acres. The rest sold off piece by piece during the lean years after his father's stroke. But these 300 acres held more history than some men carried in their hearts, and Eli had sworn on his father's grave that he'd never let another acre slip away. The house itself told the story of 3 generations of Hargrove men who'd chosen stubbornness over surrender. Built from lodgepole pine and river rock, it had weathered 60 Wyoming winters with the same resilient grace that seemed to run in the family bloodline. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the north corner, and the blue paint on the shutters had faded to the color of winter sky, but the foundation remained solid. Like the man who inhabited it, the house had learned to endure. Eli's nearest neighbor, the sprawling Diamond Creek Ranch, stretched beyond the ridge to the east, its owner Marcus Whitfield commanding 15,000 acres with the efficiency of a man who viewed land as commodity rather than legacy. Whitfield's operation ran Black Angus cattle on pastures maintained by a crew of 15 hands, most of them younger men who respected expertise over sentiment. They were good men, these cowboys, but they carried the casual cruelty that sometimes comes with youth and numbers. Down in the valley, the town of Cedar Falls had grown around the railroad stop that had brought prosperity to the region in the 1940s. Now it served primarily as a supply hub for the larger ranches and a tourist stop for city folks heading to Yellowstone. Main Street still bustled with activity, but it was the kind of activity that suggested change was coming, whether the old-timers wanted it or not. Coffee shops with names like Mountain Morning Brew had replaced the diner where Eli's father had eaten breakfast every Sunday for 20 years. Progress, they called it, though Eli had learned to be skeptical of changes that prioritized convenience over character. In the dresser drawer of his father's old bedroom, Eli kept a leather-bound journal that contained 3 generations of ranching wisdom written in 3 distinct hands. His grandfather's spidery script documented weather patterns, cattle breeding notes, and the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be learned from books. His father's bold handwriting filled the middle pages with expansion plans that never quite materialized, and dreams that had slowly been bartered away for grocery money and doctor bills. The final pages remained mostly blank, waiting for Eli's own observations, though he'd never felt worthy of adding his words to those of men who'd built something substantial. Eli had never married, a fact that provided endless speculation for the church ladies and considerable relief for his bank account. He'd come close once with Sarah McKenna, the schoolteacher who'd understood his quiet nature and appreciated his gentle way with wounded animals. But Sarah had wanted children and stability, two things that seemed increasingly impossible as the ranch struggled through the drought years of the late 90s. She'd married a banker from Cheyenne and sent Eli a Christmas card every year with photos of the children who might have been his own. He kept these cards in a shoebox and looked at them sometimes on particularly lonely evenings, wondering if his solitary life represented nobility or cowardice. The loneliness had become more pronounced in recent years, particularly during the long winter months when the nearest human conversation lay 20 miles away in Cedar Falls. Eli found himself talking to the cattle more than was probably healthy, and he'd developed the habit of reading aloud from the evening newspaper to break the silence that seemed to press against the windows like snow. He'd finally saved enough money to buy a cattle dog, a companion who could serve both practical and emotional needs without requiring the complex negotiations that seemed to define human relationships. For 8 months, he'd been setting aside $20 each week, storing the bills in an old coffee tin that had once held his mother's sewing supplies. The sacrifice had been modest but meaningful. Fewer trips to town, simpler meals, no unnecessary purchases. By October, he'd accumulated enough to buy a well-bred Australian cattle dog from a breeder in Casper, the kind of intelligent, loyal animal that could help manage the small herd and provide the companionship he'd been missing. The decision to buy a dog had taken months of careful consideration. Eli understood that bringing an animal into his life meant accepting responsibility for its welfare, and his practical nature demanded that he could afford proper veterinary care and quality food. He'd researched breeds, consulted with other ranchers, and finally settled on a cattle dog because of their reputation for loyalty and intelligence. The breeder had promised him pick of the litter from a champion bloodline, and Eli had allowed himself to imagine long evenings with a faithful companion stretched out beside his chair. The local cowboys, men who worked for Whitfield and the other large operations in the valley, had always viewed Eli with a mixture of amusement and pity. He was too soft-hearted for their taste, too willing to spend money on veterinary care for sick animals that a practical rancher would have put down. They'd watched him nurse crippled horses back to health and hand-feed orphaned calves through the winter, shaking their heads at his sentimental nature. To men who measured success in acres owned and cattle sold, Eli represented a dying breed of rancher who confused sentiment with sound business practice. Yet these same men respected his knowledge of the land and his uncanny ability to predict weather patterns weeks in advance. When storm systems threatened, they often found themselves checking to see if Eli had moved his small herd to higher ground, using his decisions as confirmation of their own instincts. He possessed an almost mystical understanding of the rhythms that governed this harsh country, knowledge that couldn't be learned from agricultural extension courses or cattle management seminars. On this particular morning, Eli had plans to drive to Casper to meet the breeder and select his dog. The coffee tin containing his carefully saved money sat on the kitchen counter, and he'd already loaded his truck with supplies for the journey. After years of patient waiting, he was finally ready to add a partner to his solitary operation, someone who would understand the language of the land and share the burden of watching over what remained of his family's legacy. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. At an age when most men were thinking about retirement and grandchildren, Eli was still fighting to preserve something that others considered a lost cause. The neighboring ranchers spoke in hushed tones about corporate buyouts and development opportunities, viewing the changing economic landscape as inevitable rather than tragic. But Eli had promised his father that the Hargrove name would remain on this land as long as he drew breath, and promises made to dying men carried weight that couldn't be measured in dollars. As he finished his coffee and prepared to head to town, Eli allowed himself a moment of optimism. Perhaps a dog would provide the companionship that had been missing from his life, and perhaps the coming years would prove that stubbornness and integrity could still triumph over convenience and compromise. He'd learned not to expect too much from life, but he'd never learned to stop hoping that tomorrow might bring something better than yesterday had delivered. The drive to Casper had taken 3 hours, through mountain passes that reminded Eli why he loved this country, despite its harsh demands. He'd arrived at the agreed meeting place, a truck stop on the outskirts of town, with his coffee tin of carefully saved bills and a heart lighter than it had been in months. The breeder, a weathered man named Tom Hutchins, was supposed to meet him at 2 o'clock with a 6-month-old cattle dog that had already shown exceptional promise in basic training. Instead, he found Jake Morrison and 2 of Whitfield's other hands standing beside a pickup truck, grinning with the kind of mischief that made Eli's stomach tighten. Jake was the youngest of Whitfield's crew, barely 25, with the cockiness that came from working for the biggest operation in the valley. The other 2, Randy Kowalski and Pete Sanchez, were older but no wiser, the type of men who found humor in other people's struggles. Well, if it ain't Eli Hargrove, Jake called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot with theatrical enthusiasm. Heard you're in the market for a working dog. Eli approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to check that his money was still secure in his jacket pocket. I'm supposed to meet Tom Hutchins here. You boys seen him around? Funny thing. About that, Randy said, spitting tobacco juice onto the asphalt. Tom had to cancel at the last minute, family emergency or some such, but we talked to him this morning and he asked us to help you out. The warning bells in Eli's mind grew louder, but he maintained his composure. These men had never shown him any particular kindness, but they were neighbors of a sort, and country etiquette demanded that he hear them out. That's thoughtful of you. What did Tom have in mind? Pete gestured toward a wooden crate in the bed of their truck. He said to tell you that this particular pup has all the qualities you're looking for. Strong bloodline, good instincts, loyal. As the day is long, he even gave us a special price since you've been saving up for so long. Eli moved closer to examine the crate, noting that it was larger than he'd expected for a cattle dog puppy. Through the wooden slats, he could see movement and hear soft whimpering sounds that tugged at something deep in his chest, the animal. Inside was clearly distressed, and Eli's natural instinct was to provide comfort regardless of the circumstances. How much is Tom asking? Eli inquired, though something about the situation felt increasingly wrong. Same as you agreed on, Jake replied quickly. $400, cash. The price was right, and Eli had exactly that amount in his coffee tin, but the expressions on the 3 men's faces suggested that this transaction involved more than simple commerce. They were enjoying themselves too much, and their enjoyment made Eli deeply uncomfortable. I'd like to see the pup before we complete any deal, Eli said firmly. Of course, Randy said, moving toward the crate with exaggerated ceremony. You're gonna love this little fella, very special animal. As Randy lifted the wooden lid, Eli stepped forward and looked down into the crate. What he saw there stopped his heart for several long seconds. Instead of the cattle dog he'd been expecting, a small wolf pup looked up at him with yellow eyes that held intelligence far beyond its age. The pup couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its coat a mixture of grey and silver that caught the afternoon light like winter moonbeams. It was beautiful and wild and completely wrong for everything Eli had planned. This is a wolf, Eli said quietly, his voice carrying no accusation, only statement of fact. Now, Eli, Jake laughed, don't go getting all technical on us. Dog, wolf, what's the difference? They're both canines, right? Both got 4 legs and a tail. The cruelty of the joke began to crystallize in Eli's mind. These men had somehow acquired a wolf pup and were attempting to pass it off as the cattle dog he'd saved for months to buy. They expected him to refuse the animal, to demand his money back, to provide them with entertainment at his expense. They wanted to see him fail, to confirm their opinion that he was too soft and naive to succeed in the hard realities of ranching life. "Boys," Pete added with fake concern, "you're not going to back out on poor Tom Hutchins, are you? He's counting on this sale. Told us you were a man of your word." Eli looked down at the wolf pup again, and something passed between them that he couldn't explain to rational minds. The animal was frightened and alone, separated from whatever family it had known, thrust into a world that would view it as dangerous simply because of what it was, rather than who it might become. The parallels to his own situation weren't lost on him. "Where did this pup come from?" Eli asked. Randy shrugged. "Does it matter? You wanted a working animal. This little guy will grow up big and strong, protect your property better than any regular dog. It's illegal to keep a wolf as a pet." "In Wyoming," Eli said. "Only if someone reports it," Jake replied with a meaningful look. "And who's gonna do that? We're all friends here, right?" The threat was subtle but clear. If Eli refused their generous offer, they would likely report him for attempting to purchase an illegal animal. If he accepted it, they could report him later for actually possessing one. Either way, they held power over him that they could exercise whenever it suited their purposes. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the coffee tin that contained 8 months of careful saving. $400 represented sacrifice and hope, the price of companionship he'd been planning for most of the year. He could walk away, demand to speak with Tom Hutchins directly, insist on the cattle dog he'd actually contracted to buy. That would be the sensible choice, the practical decision that any reasonable man would make. Instead, he counted out $400 in worn bills and handed them to Jake Morrison. "Pleasure doing business with you, Eli," Jake said, his grin widening as he pocketed the money. "Hope you and your new dog will be very happy together." Eli lifted the wolf pup from the crate, surprised by how light it felt in his hands. The animal didn't struggle or attempt to bite, seeming to understand instinctively that it had found sanctuary rather than captivity. As Eli held the pup against his chest, he could feel its rapid heartbeat beginning to slow, and something inside his own chest loosened in response. "What are you gonna name him?" Pete asked, apparently genuinely curious despite his participation in the cruel joke. Eli looked down at the pup, noting how its dark coloring seemed to absorb the surrounding light. "Shadow," he said without thinking. "I'll call her Shadow." The 3 cowboys exchanged glances, their amusement beginning to fade as they realized that their joke hadn't produced the expected result. They'd anticipated anger, frustration, maybe even tears of disappointment. Instead, they were witnessing something they didn't understand. A man accepting an impossible situation with grace and making it work through sheer force of will. As Eli walked toward his truck with Shadow cradled in his arms, he heard Jake call out behind him, "You know that thing's gonna grow up wild, right? Gonna turn on you someday when its instincts kick in." Eli paused and turned back to face the 3 men. "Maybe," he said calmly, "but then again, maybe loyalty isn't something you can breed out of any creature that's been shown genuine kindness." The drive home passed in contemplative silence, with Shadow curled up on the passenger seat, occasionally opening those yellow eyes to look at Eli, as if trying to understand what manner of human had rescued her from whatever fate she'd been facing. Eli found himself talking to her in the same gentle tone he used with frightened livestock, explaining the country they were passing through and the life they would build together. By the time they reached the Broken Arrow Ranch, Eli had begun to see the day's events not as a cruel joke, but as an unexpected opportunity. He'd gone to Casper seeking a companion and had found something far more complex and challenging. Shadow would never be the practical cattle dog he'd planned for, but she might become something even more valuable, a friend who understood what it meant to be different in a world that demanded conformity. The first week with Shadow revealed the vast difference between planning for a cattle dog and adapting to a wolf pup. Eli had prepared his barn with standard dog supplies, metal food bowls, a bag of high-quality puppy kibble, and a comfortable bed made from old blankets. But Shadow approached these offerings with the wariness of a wild creature who understood that accepting human provisions came with strings attached. She refused to eat from the metal bowls, apparently disturbed by the clanging sound they made when she nudged them with her nose. Eli solved this by offering food in a shallow wooden bowl he carved from a piece of pine, and Shadow accepted this natural alternative without hesitation. The commercial puppy food proved equally problematic. After watching her pick at it for 2 days without enthusiasm, Eli began supplementing her diet with raw meat from the cattle he butchered for his own consumption. Shadow's appetite improved dramatically, and her coat began to show the lustrous quality that spoke of proper nutrition. The most significant challenge came in the form of a thick veterinary manual Eli had borrowed from Doc Patterson, the large animal veterinarian who served the ranching community within a 100-mile radius. The manual contained detailed information about canine care, but wolves possessed different physiological and psychological needs that weren't addressed in texts. Designed for domestic animals, Eli found himself improvising solutions based on careful observation of Shadow's behavior and instincts. Creating appropriate shelter required more thought than he'd anticipated. Shadow showed no interest in sleeping indoors, preferring to find hidden spots around the ranch buildings where she could observe her surroundings while remaining concealed. After several nights of searching for her sleeping location, Eli discovered she'd been burrowing under the front porch, creating a den that provided both security and strategic positioning. Rather than force her into unnatural arrangements, he modified the space beneath the porch, reinforcing it with additional wooden supports and ensuring proper drainage for winter weather. The neighboring rancher's reaction to Shadow's presence became apparent within days of her arrival. Word traveled fast in ranching country, and the story of Eli's unusual purchase had already reached most of the valley's residents. Marcus Whitfield paid an unexpected visit on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss boundary fence repairs, but clearly motivated by curiosity about the wolf pup. "Heard you got yourself an interesting new companion," Whitfield said, settling his considerable bulk into the porch chair that Eli offered. Marcus was a large man who wore his success like expensive cologne, and his presence always made Eli feel vaguely apologetic for his own modest circumstances. Shadow had vanished at the first sound of Whitfield's approaching truck, demonstrating an ability to disappear that impressed Eli even as it concerned him. The pup possessed instincts that cattle dogs never developed, an understanding of stealth and concealment that spoke to thousands of years of survival evolution. "She's still getting adjusted to ranch life," Eli replied carefully, offering his neighbor a cup of coffee that was politely declined. "Eli, I'm going to speak plain with you," Whitfield said, his tone carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his advice taken seriously. "That animal's going to cause you nothing but trouble. Wolves aren't pets, and they sure as hell aren't working dogs. You need to get rid of it before it grows up and becomes dangerous." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of community concern about Shadow's presence. Several ranchers had already contacted the county sheriff about the legality of keeping a wolf, and there was talk of involving state wildlife officials if Eli refused to surrender the animal voluntarily. The social pressure was subtle but real, and Eli understood that his decision to keep Shadow had isolated him even further from his neighbors. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus," Eli said finally, "but Shadow hasn't caused any problems, and I don't anticipate that she will." Whitfield's expression suggested he thought Eli was being dangerously naive, but he didn't press the issue further. As he prepared to leave, however, he made a comment that would prove prophetic. "You know, Eli, sometimes a man's got to choose between being right and being smart. This wolf thing, it's going to force you to make that choice sooner than you think." The isolation that Whitfield had warned about became increasingly apparent in the days that followed. At the feed store in Cedar Falls, conversation stopped when Eli entered, and the friendly banter that had previously characterized his interactions with other ranchers was replaced by polite, but distant courtesy. Even Tom Harrison, who ran the general store and had known Eli since childhood, seemed uncomfortable discussing anything beyond basic business transactions. The only person who showed genuine interest in Shadow's welfare was Dr. Sarah McKenna, now Dr. Sarah Brennan, after 15 years of marriage to the Cheyenne banker. She encountered Eli at the post office on a Saturday morning, and their conversation revealed both the complexity of their shared history and the genuine affection that had survived their romantic disappointment. "I heard about your new companion," Sarah said, her voice carrying the warmth that Eli remembered from their younger days. "How is she adjusting?" "Better than I expected," Eli admitted. "She's smart as a whip and learns fast. Different from what I planned, but maybe different isn't always bad." Sarah studied his face with the perceptive intelligence that had made her an excellent teacher and would have made her an exceptional rancher's wife. "You know people are talking, don't you? Some folks are saying you've lost your judgment." "And what do you think?" Eli asked, genuinely interested in her opinion. "I think you've always had better instincts about animals than most people have about other people," she replied. "But I also think you're taking on more than you realize. Wolves need different things than dogs, Eli. They need pack structure, territory, purpose. Are you prepared to provide all that?" The question haunted Eli for days afterward. He'd been so focused on the immediate challenges of food and shelter that he hadn't considered Shadow's long-term psychological needs. As she grew larger and stronger, would her wild instincts override the bond they were building? Would she become dangerous, not out of malice, but simply because her nature demanded behaviors that couldn't be satisfied in domestic situations? Yet watching Shadow explore the ranch with intelligent curiosity, seeing how she'd begun to follow him on his daily rounds without ever being taught to heel, Eli found himself believing that love and patience could bridge even the gap between wild and domestic. She'd begun sleeping closer to the house, emerging from her den each morning when she heard him preparing breakfast, and her yellow eyes had lost some of their wariness when they looked at him. Perhaps the cynics were right, and he was fooling himself about Shadow's potential for domestication. But perhaps they were wrong about something more fundamental. Perhaps the capacity for loyalty and love wasn't limited to creatures that humans had bred for submission. 3 months into their partnership, Shadow demonstrated an intelligence that left Eli both amazed and unsettled. The first sign came on a bitter November morning when he discovered her sitting motionless beside the gate to the east pasture, her attention focused on something beyond his ability to perceive. When he approached to investigate, Shadow moved deliberately toward a section of fence where the wire had been cut during the night, apparently by someone hoping to make Eli's small cattle herd wander onto neighboring property. The vandalism represented more than simple mischief. In ranching country, allowing cattle to stray onto someone else's land could result in impoundment fees, property damage claims, and legal complications that a man with Eli's limited resources couldn't afford to fight. Shadow had somehow detected the problem before dawn and positioned herself as an early warning system, preventing what could have been a financial disaster. As winter deepened, Shadow's usefulness became increasingly apparent despite her unconventional nature. She possessed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes days in advance, becoming restless and positioning herself strategically before storms that caught even Eli's experienced instincts by surprise. When a late December blizzard dropped 3 feet of snow across the valley, Shadow guided him to places where cattle had taken shelter, locations he might never have found without her assistance. The artifact that best represented their evolving relationship was a simple leather collar that Eli crafted from an old horse bridle, not because Shadow needed restraint, but because he wanted her to carry identification in case she was ever found away from the ranch. He tooled his name and phone number into the leather, using techniques his grandfather had taught him, creating something both functional and beautiful. Shadow accepted the collar without resistance, seeming to understand that it represented belonging rather than ownership. But their partnership faced its most serious challenge when Deputy Sheriff Tom Radcliffe arrived at the ranch on a cold January afternoon, his official vehicle and grim expression signaling trouble that couldn't be avoided through diplomacy or good intentions. Radcliffe was a decent man who'd grown up in the valley, but he carried the authority of state law and the pressure of community concern about Shadow's presence. "Eli," Radcliffe said, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch, "I'm afraid we need to talk about your wolf." Shadow had vanished at the first sound of the approaching vehicle, demonstrating the evasion skills that had kept her hidden from curious neighbors for months. Her ability to disappear completely within seconds still amazed Eli, though he understood that this talent would complicate any official attempts to document her presence. "What seems to be the problem, Tom?" Eli asked, gesturing toward the porch. Chairs, with the hospitality that Wyoming etiquette demanded, even during uncomfortable conversations. "I've had multiple complaints about you keeping a dangerous wild animal without proper permits," Radcliffe replied, settling his lean frame into the offered chair. "State wildlife officials want to investigate, and they have authority to seize any illegally kept wildlife." The conversation that followed revealed the political complexities surrounding Shadow's presence. Marcus Whitfield had used his considerable influence to pressure state officials, citing concerns about livestock safety and public welfare. Other ranchers had joined the complaint, arguing that wolves posed an unacceptable threat to their operations and that allowing Eli to keep Shadow set a dangerous precedent for other residents who might attempt to domesticate wild animals. "I understand their concerns, Tom," Eli said carefully, "but Shadow has never threatened anyone or caused any problems. She stays on my property and doesn't interfere with neighboring operations." "That's not really the point, Eli," Radcliffe replied with obvious regret. "The law is pretty clear about keeping native wildlife as pets. Even if you could prove she was legally acquired, which seems doubtful given the circumstances, you'd need special permits that require facilities and expertise you don't possess." The deputy's visit was technically a courtesy call, a chance for Eli to surrender Shadow voluntarily before state officials arrived with capture equipment and legal authority. Radcliffe made it clear that he hoped to resolve the situation without drama, but he also emphasized that continuing resistance would only make things worse for everyone involved. After Radcliffe left, Eli sat on his porch, watching the winter sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Shadow emerged from wherever she'd been hiding, approaching with the cautious dignity that characterized all her movements. She sat beside his chair and placed her head against his knee, a gesture of affection that had developed naturally over the months they'd spent together. "We're in trouble, girl," Eli said softly, running his fingers through her thick winter coat. "Folks are scared of what you might become, and fear makes people do things they might not otherwise consider." The irony wasn't lost on him that Shadow's very success as a companion had created the problems they now faced. Her intelligence and adaptability had made her an effective ranch helper, but these same qualities reinforced people's concerns about her wild nature. She was too wolf-like to be accepted as a dog, but too domesticated to be treated as wildlife that belonged in its natural habitat. Over the following days, Eli found himself caught between competing loyalties. His practical side understood that keeping Shadow would eventually result in legal consequences that could threaten his ability to maintain the ranch. His emotional side recognized that surrendering her would represent a betrayal of the trust she'd placed in him and the bond they'd built through months of patient companionship. The solution, when it came, arrived in the form of an unexpected conversation with Dr. Patterson, the veterinarian who'd become increasingly interested in Shadow's development. Patterson had been quietly documenting her behavior and health, creating an unofficial record that demonstrated her remarkable adaptation to domestic life. "I've been thinking about your situation, Eli," Patterson said during a routine visit to check on Eli's cattle. There might be a way to keep Shadow legally, but it would require some paperwork and a few changes to how you present her to the authorities. The plan Patterson outlined was complex, but potentially viable. Instead of treating Shadow as a pet, they could establish her as part of a wildlife education program, with Eli serving as her primary caretaker under veterinary supervision. This arrangement would require permits and inspections, but it would legitimize her presence while providing educational opportunities for local schools and community groups. It's not perfect, Patterson admitted, but it might be enough to satisfy the legal requirements while allowing you to keep her safe. As winter began to fade and the first hints of spring appeared in the high country, Eli found himself cautiously optimistic that he and Shadow might navigate the challenges facing them. Their partnership had survived its first major test, and perhaps it would prove strong enough to overcome whatever obstacles the future might present. The spring of Shadow's second year brought changes that seemed to mirror the seasonal transformation occurring across the Wyoming landscape. As the snow melted and revealed winter's damage to fences and outbuildings, Eli found himself confronting challenges that extended far beyond the practical demands of ranch maintenance. The wildlife education permit that Dr. Patterson had helped him obtain lay framed on his kitchen wall, its official state seal providing legal protection for Shadow's presence, while imposing responsibilities that weighed heavily on Eli's shoulders. The permit required monthly educational programs for local schools and community groups, transformations that forced Eli to become something he'd never intended to be, a public speaker and wildlife educator. Standing before groups of curious children and skeptical adults, explaining Shadow's behavior and the complex relationship between humans and wild animals, pushed him far outside his natural comfort zone. Yet these presentations revealed aspects of his character that surprised even him, particularly his ability to communicate complex ideas with patience and clarity. Shadow's growth had been remarkable, both physically and psychologically. At 18 months, she stood taller than most German shepherds, her coat having developed the magnificent silver-gray coloring that caught sunlight like winter frost. Her intelligence had evolved beyond simple learning into something approaching wisdom, and her loyalty to Eli had deepened into a bond that seemed almost telepathic in its intensity. Yet her wild heritage remained apparent in the way she moved. Through the landscape, her instincts attuned to subtleties that domestic animals never perceived. The educational programs had an unexpected consequence. They began to change community attitudes toward both Shadow and Eli. Children who visited the ranch approached Shadow without fear, sensing her gentle nature despite her intimidating size. Their parents, watching their offspring interact safely with an animal they'd been taught to fear, began to question their assumptions about wild predators and the men who chose to live alongside them. But this growing acceptance created its own complications. Marcus Whitfield's opposition to Shadow's presence had intensified rather than diminished, and he'd begun organizing other large ranches to challenge the legitimacy of the wildlife education program. The official complaints he filed with state agencies questioned Eli's qualifications as an educator and suggested that the permit system was being abused to legitimize what remained fundamentally illegal activity. The pressure campaign included subtle but unmistakable economic warfare. Feed suppliers who'd done business with Eli for decades suddenly experienced inventory shortages when he needed supplies. Equipment dealers found reasons to delay repairs on his machinery. The local bank, where Whitfield served on the board of directors, began reviewing Eli's modest line of credit with unprecedented scrutiny. Each individual action was defensible, but collectively they represented a coordinated effort to force him off his land. The strain of fighting these battles while maintaining the ranch and caring for Shadow began to take its toll on Eli's health and spirit. Sleep became elusive as he worried about legal challenges, financial pressures, and the possibility that his stubbornness was putting Shadow at risk. The coffee tin, where he'd once saved money for a cattle dog, now held funds earmarked for legal fees and permit renewals, a symbol of how dramatically his life had changed since that day in Casper. During this difficult period, Eli found unexpected support from Sarah Brennan, whose concern for his welfare had evolved into active assistance with the educational programs. Her background as a teacher proved invaluable in developing curriculum materials and managing the logistics of school visits. More importantly, her friendship provided emotional support during moments when the challenges seemed overwhelming. "No, you don't have to fight this battle alone," Sarah told him during one of their planning sessions for an upcoming presentation to the Rotary Club. "There are people in this community who respect what you're doing, even if they don't always speak up about it." Their renewed friendship, conducted within the boundaries appropriate to a married woman and a solitary rancher, provided Eli with perspective on choices he'd made and roads he hadn't taken. Sarah's marriage had given her the security and family she'd wanted, but her involvement with the wildlife education program seemed to fulfill needs that domestic life hadn't addressed. For Eli, her presence reminded him that connection and understanding could exist even when circumstances prevented deeper relationships. The artifact that came to symbolize this period was a thick folder of correspondence between Eli and various state agencies, a paper trail documenting every permit application, inspection report, and legal challenge related to Shadow's presence. The folder represented the bureaucratic complexity that had transformed his simple desire for companionship into a public endeavor requiring constant vigilance and defense. Shadow herself seemed aware of the tensions surrounding her existence, demonstrating increased protectiveness toward Eli and heightened alertness to potential threats. Her ability to detect approaching vehicles miles before they became visible to human eyes proved invaluable during unannounced inspections by state wildlife officials. More than once, her early warning allowed Eli to prepare for encounters that might otherwise have caught him off guard. The most serious challenge came in the form of a letter from the State Wildlife Commission announcing a comprehensive review of all educational permits involving potentially dangerous animals. The review, clearly prompted by Whitfield's influence, would examine Eli's facilities, qualifications, and safety protocols with unprecedented thoroughness. Failure to meet any requirement could result in immediate permit revocation and Shadow's removal to a state wildlife facility. As Eli read the letter on a warm May evening, with Shadow resting beside his chair and the last light fading from the mountains, he reflected on the irony of his situation. The community that had once dismissed him as too soft-hearted now attacked him for being too stubborn. The animal they'd given him as a joke had become the center of a controversy that threatened everything he'd spent his life trying to preserve. Yet, looking at Shadow, seeing the intelligence and loyalty in her yellow eyes, Eli knew that he would continue fighting regardless of the personal cost. Some bonds transcended practical considerations, and some promises, even those made to creatures rather than people, deserved to be kept no matter how difficult the circumstances became. The battle for Shadow's future had become inseparable from the battle for his own identity and the survival of values that seemed increasingly rare in a world that measured worth primarily through economic success. Whether he possessed the strength and resources to win remained an open question, but surrender was no longer an option he could seriously consider. The comprehensive permit review arrived on Eli's doorstep in the form of 3 state officials, who treated their inspection with the solemnity of a criminal investigation. Shadow, now 3 years old and in her magnificent prime, demonstrated the poise and intelligence that had characterized her adaptation to domestic life. But the officials seemed more interested in finding violations than acknowledging her remarkable Development, Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead wildlife biologist, conducted her examination with professional detachment that bordered on hostility. She measured Shadow's enclosure spaces, tested water quality, reviewed feed records, and documented every aspect of the ranch's educational program with meticulous precision. Her two assistants photographed everything from fence heights to safety, equipment, creating an exhaustive record that would support whatever conclusions they'd already reached. "Mr. Hargrove," Dr. Foster said during their final meeting, "I have to commend you on the quality of care you've provided this animal. However, I have serious concerns about the long-term viability of this arrangement. The criticism that followed focused not on Shadow's welfare or behavior, but on theoretical risks that might never materialize." Foster argued that a single wolf couldn't receive proper socialization, that educational programs exposed children to unnecessary danger, and that Eli lacked the advanced training required for managing apex predators. Each objection was technically valid, while ignoring the reality of what had actually been accomplished. "We'll have our report completed within 30 days, Foster concluded. "Until then, the permit remains under review, and any educational activities must be suspended." The suspension of educational programs eliminated Eli's primary defense against critics who argued that Shadow served no legitimate public purpose. Without regular school visits and community presentations to demonstrate her value as an educational resource, she became simply an expensive liability that drained his resources while providing ammunition for his opponents. During this vulnerable period, Eli received an unexpected visitor that would prove to be the beginning of a much larger threat. James Crawford arrived at the ranch in a luxury sedan that seemed almost absurd against the backdrop of weathered buildings and mountain landscape. Crawford introduced himself as a land acquisition specialist representing Pinnacle Development Corporation, a company Eli had never heard of, but which apparently possessed detailed knowledge of his property and financial situation. "Mr. Hargrove," Crawford said, accepting the coffee that Wyoming hospitality demanded, while clearly preferring something more sophisticated, "I'm here to discuss an opportunity that could solve many of your current problems." The proposal Crawford outlined was both generous and disturbing. Pinnacle Development wanted to purchase Eli's 300 acres for significantly more than its appraised value, part of a larger project that would transform the entire valley into a luxury resort destination. The company had already acquired options on several neighboring properties and was prepared to offer Eli enough money to relocate anywhere he chose while maintaining a comfortable lifestyle. "We understand your attachment to this land," Crawford continued, producing a folder of legal documents that represented months of preparation. "That's why we're prepared to offer 3 times the current market value. You could buy a larger spread somewhere else, maybe closer to amenities and medical facilities that a man your age might appreciate." The artifact that would haunt Eli's thoughts in the days that followed was a detailed site plan showing Pinnacle's vision for the valley. The Broken Arrow Ranch appeared on the map as Heritage Village, a cluster of luxury cabins designed to provide tourists with an authentic Western experience. The irony of destroying authentic Western heritage to create a simulation of it wasn't lost on Eli, but the financial temptation was undeniably real. Crawford's offer included provisions for Shadow's care, arrangements that demonstrated the company's thorough research into Eli's circumstances. Pinnacle would fund her relocation to a wildlife sanctuary in Colorado, ensuring that she received professional care while Eli avoided the legal complications that seemed increasingly inevitable if she remained at the ranch. "I understand this is a big decision," Crawford said as he prepared to leave, "but I should mention that Pinnacle's plans will proceed regardless of your participation. Other landowners have already committed to the project, and the county commissioners are very supportive of the economic development it represents." The threat underlying Crawford's polite words became clearer over the following days as Eli researched Pinnacle Development Corporation and its track record in similar projects. The company specialized in acquiring rural land for luxury developments, using a combination of generous buyouts for willing sellers and legal pressure tactics for holdouts. Their standard approach involved isolating resistant property owners through economic pressure and regulatory challenges until selling became the only viable option. Marcus Whitfield's campaign against Shadow suddenly made more sense when viewed in this context. His complaints to state wildlife officials weren't motivated by legitimate safety concerns, but by his desire to eliminate Eli's legal protections before Pinnacle made their formal acquisition attempt. The permit review that threatened Shadow's future was simply another tool in a coordinated effort to force Eli off his land. Understanding the true nature of the threat he faced brought clarity to decisions that had seemed impossibly complex. This wasn't really about Shadow's permit or the legitimacy of wildlife education programs. It was about corporate power, overwhelming individual rights, about profit margins that reduced family heritage to negotiable commodities. The battle for Shadow's future had become inseparable from the battle for his land, and losing either would mean losing everything that defined his identity. Sarah Brennan's support became even more crucial as Eli struggled to develop strategies for fighting an opponent with virtually unlimited resources. Her teaching background proved valuable in researching legal precedents and administrative procedures, while her community connections provided insights into local political dynamics that could influence the outcome. "You're not just fighting. And for yourself," she reminded him during one of their strategy sessions. "There are other families in this valley who've been here for generations. If Pinnacle succeeds with your land, they'll have a template for acquiring everyone else's property on their terms." The weight of representing something larger than his own interests added pressure to an already difficult situation, but it also provided motivation that transcended personal considerations. Eli's grandfather had settled this land when it was a still wild country that demanded everything a man could give. His father had held onto it through drought, disease, and economic hardship that would have broken lesser men. The idea of surrendering it to corporate developers who saw it only as raw material for profit felt like betraying not just his own values, but the sacrifice of generations who'd invested their lives in making something permanent from wilderness. As spring progressed towards summer, with the permit review deadline approaching and Pinnacle's pressure increasing, Eli found himself preparing for the most important fight of his life, knowing that defeat would mean losing everything he'd ever cared about. The revelation came through. The most unlikely source, Jake Morrison, the young cowboy who'd orchestrated the cruel joke with the wolf pup 3 years earlier. He appeared at Eli's ranch on a humid June evening, his usual cockiness replaced by an anxiety that made him seem years younger than his actual age. Shadow sensed his distress before Eli did, positioning herself protectively between the visitor and her human companion while maintaining the alert stillness that preceded action. "I need to talk to you, Eli," Jake said, his voice carrying none of the theatrical confidence that had characterized their previous encounters. "It's about that. Day and Casper. About the wolf pup. There's things you don't know, things I should have told you a long time ago." Eli studied the young man's face, noting the sleepless shadows under his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. Whatever had brought Jake to the ranch was serious enough to overcome the pride that typically prevented cowboys from admitting mistakes or showing vulnerability. "Come up on the porch," Eli said quietly. "Say what you came to say." The story Jake told over the next hour recontextualized everything Eli thought he understood about the past. 3 years. The wolf pup hadn't been acquired through random opportunity or spontaneous cruelty. Jake had been contacted by James Crawford weeks before the planned meeting in Casper, hired to disrupt Eli's purchase of a cattle dog and provide him instead with an animal that would create legal problems and community opposition. Crawford told As you were standing in the way of progress, Jake explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Said you were too stubborn to sell your land voluntarily, so they needed to create pressure that would force you off the property. The wolf was supposed to get you in trouble with wildlife officials, maybe even arrested for illegal possession of dangerous animals. The artifact that Jake pulled from his jacket pocket was a bank deposit receipt showing a payment of $5,000 deposited to his account 3 days before the Casper meeting. The payment came from an account registered to Pinnacle Development Corporation, proving that the cruel joke had been carefully orchestrated corporate sabotage rather than simple cowboy mischief. I kept this because something about the whole thing felt wrong, Jake continued, but I was young and stupid, and $5,000 seemed like more money than I'd ever see again. I didn't think about what it would mean for you or the wolf. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond the original deception. If Pinnacle had been planning Eli's removal 3 years ago, their current acquisition efforts represented the culmination of a long-term strategy rather than a recent opportunity. They'd anticipated his attachment to the land and had systematically created circumstances designed to make keeping it impossible. "There's more," Jake said, his discomfort increasing as he prepared to reveal the full scope of what he knew. "Crawford's been paying people all over the valley. Ranch hands, store owners, even some of the county officials. Everyone who's been making your life difficult, questioning your permits, creating problems with supplies and credit. They're all on Pinnacle's payroll." The conspiracy was more extensive than Eli had imagined. Marcus Whitfield's opposition to Shadow wasn't motivated by legitimate concerns about livestock safety, but by financial incentives provided by Pinnacle Development. The state wildlife officials who'd conducted the permit review had been influenced by carefully orchestrated complaints from supposedly concerned citizens who were actually paid agitators. Even some of the ranchers who'd signed petitions against Shadow's presence had been compensated for their participation. "Why are you telling me this now?" Eli asked, studying Jake's face for signs of deception or hidden motives. "Because I've been watching what they've done to you, and it ain't right," Jake replied, with the first genuine emotion he'd shown since arriving. "You took that wolf and made something good out of what was supposed to destroy you. You turned their trap into something beautiful, and they're still trying to punish you for it." The young cowboy's confession continued for another hour, revealing details about Pinnacle's operations that explained mysteries Eli had never been able to solve. The cut fence that Shadow had detected during her first month at the ranch hadn't been random vandalism, but a deliberate attempt to create liability issues that would support legal action against Eli's property. The inspection delays and regulatory challenges hadn't been bureaucratic incompetence, but coordinated harassment designed to exhaust his financial resources and emotional resilience. "Crawford's been planning this for years," Jake explained. "He told us that small landowners like you were obstacles to progress, that you'd eventually realize you couldn't fight against economic reality, but you didn't give up, and that made them nervous." As Jake prepared to leave, he provided one final piece of information that changed everything Eli thought he knew about his situation. Tom Hutchins, the legitimate dog breeder who was supposed to meet Eli and Casper, had never cancelled their appointment. He'd been intercepted by Pinnacle operatives and paid to disappear for the day, allowing Jake and his accomplices to take his place without Eli realizing that the entire transaction was fraudulent. "Hutchins still has that cattle dog you were supposed to buy," Jake said. "Crawford made him promise never to contact you, but the dog's still there if you ever want to complete the original deal." After Jake left, Eli sat on his porch, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. Shadow lay beside his chair, her presence providing comfort during a moment when the familiar world seemed to have shifted beneath his feet. Everything he'd attributed to bad luck, community prejudice, or bureaucratic incompetence had actually been deliberate sabotage, orchestrated by people who viewed his modest ranch as an impediment to their grander ambitions. The realization brought both anger and clarity. For 3 years, he'd been fighting what seemed like separate battles, defending Shadow's right to exist, maintaining his educational permits, preserving his financial stability, and protecting his land from corporate acquisition. Now he understood that these weren't separate conflicts, but coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm his ability to resist on any single front. Yet the conspiracy had also revealed something that its architects hadn't anticipated. In trying to destroy Eli through the wolf pup, they'd actually given him the one thing that could help him survive their assault. Shadow's intelligence, loyalty, and unique capabilities had proven more valuable than any cattle dog could have. Ibeen, her presence had attracted supporters like Sarah Brennan and Dr. Patterson, people who might never have become involved in Eli's struggles without the educational program that Shadow made possible. The irony wasn't lost on him that Pinnacle's attempt to sabotage his life had instead provided him with the tools necessary to fight back. They'd underestimated both his character and Shadow's potential, assumptions that might prove to be their downfall. As he reflected on the evening's revelations, Eli began to see possibilities that hadn't existed before Jake's confession. Evidence of Pinnacle's illegal activities could be used to expose their entire operation, potentially stopping their acquisition plans while protecting other landowners who were facing similar pressure. More importantly, understanding the true nature of his opponents allowed him to develop strategies based on reality rather than speculation. The battle for his land and Shadow's future was far from over, but for the first time in months, Eli felt that victory might be possible. The weapons he needed to fight back had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. That moment had finally arrived, and with it came the opportunity to turn Pinnacle's own tactics against them. The days following, Jake Morrison's confession transformed Eli's approach to the challenges threatening his ranch and Shadow's future. Where he'd previously reacted to crises as they developed, he now found himself planning strategies with the deliberate precision of a general preparing for decisive battle. The leather-bound notebook that became his constant companion during this period contained detailed plans, contact information, and evidence documentation that would either save everything he cared about or provide a record of his final stand. Sarah Brennan's involvement in developing these strategies proved invaluable, her analytical mind complementing Eli's intuitive understanding of local politics and relationships. Together, they mapped out Pinnacle Development's network of influence, identifying every person and institution that had been compromised by corporate money. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. It included county commissioners, state, regulatory officials, business owners, and even some church leaders who'd accepted donations in exchange for supporting Pinnacle's acquisition plans. "We need irrefutable documentation before we make any accusations," Sarah warned during one of their strategy sessions. "Crawford and his people are professionals at this kind of manipulation. If we come forward with incomplete evidence, they'll discredit us and accelerate their timeline for acquiring your property." The evidence gathering required patience and subtlety that tested Eli's natural inclination toward direct confrontation. Working with Dr. Patterson, they documented every instance of regulatory harassment and bureaucratic delay that had targeted the wildlife education program. Sarah's connections in the school system provided access to communications showing how educational visits had been discouraged through administrative pressure rather than legitimate safety concerns. Meanwhile, Shadow herself played an unexpected role in the intelligence-gathering process. Her ability to detect approaching vehicles from miles away allowed Eli to monitor Pinnacle operatives who'd begun conducting surveillance of his property. More than once, Shadow's early warning system enabled him to observe meetings between Crawford and local collaborators, encounters that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy's reach. The most crucial breakthrough came when Jake Morrison agreed. to cooperate fully in exposing Pinnacle's illegal activities. The young cowboy's guilt over his role in the original deception had transformed into determination to help bring down the people who'd used him as an unwitting weapon against Eli. Jake provided bank records, recorded conversations, and detailed accounts of meetings that documented years of coordinated harassment and bribery. "I know I can't undo what I did 3 years ago," Jake told Eli during one of their planning sessions, "but maybe I can help you turn it into something that stops these people from destroying other families." The strategy they developed was complex, but comprehensive. Rather than simply defending against Pinnacle's acquisition attempts, they would expose the entire conspiracy to federal authorities who had jurisdiction over corporate fraud and racketeering. The evidence they'd gathered showed a pattern of illegal activity that extended beyond Wyoming to similar projects in Colorado, Montana, and Idaho, where Pinnacle had used identical tactics to acquire ranch land for development. Dr. Patterson's professional reputation proved crucial in legitimizing their claims. As a respected veterinarian with no apparent bias in the dispute, his documentation of the harassment campaign carried weight that might be denied to complaints from affected parties. His willingness to testify about the coordinated nature of the regulatory challenges helped establish the conspiracy's scope and intent. The most emotionally difficult aspect of their preparation involved contingency planning for Shadow's future if their efforts failed. Sarah insisted that they develop backup arrangements that would protect Shadow regardless of what happened to Eli's property rights. Through her connections with wildlife rehabilitation organizations, she identified facilities that could provide proper care if Shadow needed to be relocated. "I won't let them use her as leverage against you," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever happens with the land, Shadow deserves a future that honors what you've accomplished together." These conversations forced Eli to confront the possibility that he might lose everything despite their careful planning. Pinnacle possessed resources and connections that could overcome even the most compelling evidence if they chose to fight dirty. The prospect of losing his land, his home, and his companion to corporate greed filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. Yet this anger also provided clarity about what really mattered in the battles ahead. The land itself was important because of what it represented: family legacy, connection to place, and values that couldn't be reduced to economic calculations. Shadow was important because of what their relationship had revealed about loyalty, adaptation, and the possibility of finding family in unexpected forms. Fighting for these things wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about defending the kind of future where such relationships remained possible. As the final confrontation approached, Eli found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years earlier, he'd been a lonely man whose modest dreams had been shattered by what seemed like casual cruelty. The wolf pup that was supposed to destroy him had instead taught him lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the kind of loyalty that transcended species boundaries. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt when community pressure seemed overwhelming, times when the financial and legal challenges appeared insurmountable. Shadow's wild nature had required constant attention and adaptation, forcing Eli to become someone different than he'd been before, more patient, more creative, more willing to challenge conventional wisdom when it conflicted with observed reality. But the partnership they'd built had also revealed strengths he'd never known he possessed. The public speaking required for educational programs had developed his ability to communicate complex ideas to diverse audiences. The regulatory battles had taught him to navigate bureaucratic systems with skill that surprised even experienced lawyers. Most importantly, the experience of raising Shadow had shown him that love and dedication could overcome obstacles that seemed impossible to rational analysis. The night before their planned confrontation with Pinnacle representatives, Eli sat on his porch, with Shadow resting beside his chair, watching stars appear in the clear mountain sky. The familiar ritual provided comfort during a time when everything else seemed uncertain, a reminder of the simple pleasures that made life worth defending. "Tomorrow we find out if everything we've worked for was worth the effort," he said quietly, running his fingers through Shadow's thick coat. "I want you to know that whatever happens, these have been the best years of my life. You gave me purpose." When I'd forgotten what that felt like, Shadow's response was to move closer to his chair, her presence providing the reassurance that had sustained him through countless difficult nights. Their bond had begun as an accident of circumstances, but it had evolved into something that defined both their identities. They'd become family in the truest sense, not through blood or formal arrangement, but through shared experience and mutual commitment. The plan for the following day was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. Eli, Sarah, Dr. Patterson, and Jake would present their evidence to a joint meeting of federal investigators, state officials, and county commissioners, forcing a public confrontation that would make continued cover-up impossible. The evidence they'd gathered was compelling, but success would depend on their ability to present it effectively while countering whatever responses Pinnacle had prepared. Crawford and his associates would undoubtedly have lawyers present, professionals, skilled at creating doubt about even the most straightforward evidence. They would attack the credibility of witnesses, question the relevance of documentation, and argue that business practices that seemed corrupt were actually standard industry procedures. The battle would be fought with words and documents rather than weapons, but the stakes were just as high as any physical confrontation. As midnight approached and the mountain silence settled around the ranch, Eli made his final preparations for the most important day of his life. The leather notebook containing their strategy and evidence sat on the kitchen table beside his father's journal. 2 books representing different approaches to preserving what mattered most. His father's generation had built their legacy through physical labor and patient accumulation of property. Eli's generation would have to defend that legacy through legal strategies and public advocacy, skills that previous generations hadn't needed to develop. Yet both approaches required the same fundamental qualities: courage, persistence, and a faith that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Looking at Shadow sleeping peacefully beside the door, trusting completely in his ability to protect her future, Eli felt the weight of responsibility that had defined his entire adult life. Tomorrow would determine whether that responsibility had been discharged with wisdom and strength, or whether he'd allowed the last remnant of his family's legacy to slip away through inadequate preparation and insufficient resolve. The county courthouse had never hosted a meeting quite like the one that convened on that sweltering July morning. The main conference room buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as representatives from multiple agencies took their seats around the polished oak table that had witnessed decades of local political drama. Federal investigators from the FBI's white-collar crime division sat alongside state wildlife officials, county commissioners, and a stenographer whose machine would record every word of what promised to be a historic confrontation. James Crawford arrived with 3 attorneys and a briefcase full of documents designed to counter whatever accusations might be leveled against Pinnacle Development Corporation. His usual polished confidence seemed slightly strained as he surveyed the room and realized that the meeting's scope extended far beyond the simple land acquisition dispute he'd expected to resolve through routine legal maneuvering. Eli entered the courthouse wearing his best shirt and the same boots he'd worn to his father's funeral, carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through 3 years of harassment and uncertainty. Shadow waited in Sarah's truck outside, her presence providing emotional support, even though she couldn't participate directly in the proceedings that would determine her future. Sarah Brennan had transformed herself from small-town teacher to formidable advocate, her research and preparation evident in the organized folders and careful documentation she arranged on the table. Dr. Patterson brought his professional credibility and detailed records of the regulatory harassment that had targeted Eli's wildlife education program. Jake Morrison sat slightly apart from the others, his testimony representing the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. Special Agent Catherine Walsh, the FBI's lead investigator on corporate fraud cases involving rural land acquisition, opened the proceedings with a statement that set the tone for everything that followed. "We're here to examine allegations that Pinnacle Development Corporation has engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment, bribery, and fraud designed to force property owners to sell their land below market value." The first evidence presented was the bank deposit receipt that Jake had preserved from his payment 3 years earlier. The simple piece of paper, worn from handling but still clearly legible, connected Pinnacle directly to the wolf pup incident that had started Eli's troubles. Crawford's attorneys immediately objected that the payment proved nothing illegal, arguing that hiring local cowboys to facilitate livestock transactions was standard business practice. But Jake's testimony destroyed that defense with devastating precision. Speaking in the measured tone of a man who'd found courage through confronting his own mistakes, he detailed the instructions he'd received from Crawford's associates. The plan hadn't been to facilitate any legitimate transaction, but to sabotage Eli's attempt to purchase a cattle dog and replace it with an animal that would create legal problems and community opposition. "They told us Mr. Hargrove was standing in the way of progress," Jake testified, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "They said we needed to create pressure that would force him to sell. The wolf pup was supposed to get him arrested or at least make keeping his property so expensive and complicated that he'd give up." Crawford's lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Manning, attempted to discredit Jake's testimony by highlighting his youth and suggesting that his memory of 3-year-old conversations might be unreliable. But her attack backfired when Jake produced a small digital recorder that he'd used to document his meetings with Pinnacle operatives. The artifact that changed everything was a compilation of audio recordings that Jake had secretly made during his involvement with the conspiracy. The recordings captured Crawford and his associates discussing not only their plans for Eli's property, but similar operations targeting other ranch families throughout the region. The conversations revealed a calculated strategy of using regulatory harassment, economic pressure, and social isolation to force property sales at artificially depressed prices. Agent Walsh's expression grew increasingly grim as she listened to Crawford's voice on the recordings, describing small ranchers as obstacles to economic development who needed to be managed out of the market through creative pressure applications. The casual cruelty in his tone as he discussed destroying families' livelihoods for corporate profit provided a stark contrast to the polished presentations that typically characterized development proposals. The most damaging recording captured Crawford instructing his associates to make that old fool with the wolf understand that fighting progress is expensive. The conversation included specific directions for bribing county officials, pressuring state wildlife agencies, and coordinating with local businesses to create financial difficulties for targeted property owners. Dr. Patterson's presentation of the regulatory harassment timeline provided visual confirmation of the audio evidence. His charts showed how complaints against Eli's wildlife education program had spiked immediately after Pinnacle's initial approach, with each challenge corresponding to documented payments to supposed concerned citizens who'd filed formal objections. As the morning progressed, the scope of Pinnacle's illegal activities became undeniable. The federal investigators found themselves documenting a conspiracy that extended across multiple states and involved dozens of local officials who'd accepted bribes in exchange for targeting property owners who refused to sell to development corporations. Crawford's attorneys made increasingly desperate attempts to minimize their client's culpability, arguing that the recorded conversations represented hypothetical discussions rather than actual criminal planning. But the documentary evidence and witness testimony painted a clear picture of systematic fraud that had destroyed families and corrupted local institutions across the American West. The morning session ended with Agent Walsh announcing that federal charges would be filed against Pinnacle Development Corporation and its associates, effectively ending their acquisition plans and protecting not only Eli's property, but dozens of other ranch families who'd been targeted by similar tactics. The afternoon session transformed from legal proceeding to something approaching public catharsis, as the full scope of Pinnacle's corruption became undeniable. County commissioners who'd accepted bribes found themselves facing federal charges, while state officials scrambled to distance themselves from decisions that had been influenced by corporate money rather than legitimate policy concerns. The carefully constructed network of influence that had seemed so powerful that morning was collapsing under the weight of documented evidence and recorded admissions. James Crawford's composure finally cracked when Agent Walsh played the recording, where he explicitly discussed using shadow as a weapon against Eli's emotional stability. "The old fool loves that wolf more than his own welfare," Crawford's voice said through the courthouse speakers. "We keep pressuring the animal's legal status, and eventually he'll choose the wolf's safety over his own stubbornness." The cold calculation in Crawford's tone as he discussed manipulating Eli's love for Shadow revealed the corporate mindset that viewed human emotions as weaknesses to be exploited rather than bonds to be respected. Several people in the courthouse gallery, ranchers who'd known Eli for decades, shook their heads in disgust at the casual cruelty they were witnessing. Dr. Patterson seized this moment to present his comprehensive evaluation of Shadow's development, a document that had taken months to prepare and would serve as the artifact defining this chapter's resolution. The report detailed 3 years of behavioral observations, health records, and educational program outcomes that demonstrated Shadow's remarkable adaptation to domestic life while maintaining her essential wild nature. This animal has participated in over 200 educational presentations, Dr. Patterson testified, his professional authority lending weight to every word. She has interacted safely with more than 3,000 children and adults, many of whom gained their first realistic understanding of wildlife behavior through direct observation. The suggestion that she represents a public danger is not supported by any credible evidence. The veterinarian's report included testimonials from teachers, parents, and wildlife biologists who'd observed Shadow's behavior during educational programs. Their statements painted a picture of an intelligent, well-adjusted animal who'd formed an extraordinary bond with her human companion while serving valuable educational purposes that couldn't be achieved through conventional methods. Sarah Brennan's presentation of community support surveys provided additional evidence that public opinion had shifted dramatically during the 3 years since Shadow's arrival at the ranch. What had begun as fearful opposition had evolved into respectful admiration as people witnessed the reality of Eli and Shadow's partnership rather than accepting assumptions about wolf behavior based on prejudice and misinformation. The community that once demanded this animal's removal now considers her a local treasure, Sarah testified. Children who've participated in educational programs have become advocates for wildlife conservation. Adults who initially opposed the permit now volunteer to help with presentations. This transformation represents exactly the kind of positive outcome that wildlife education programs are designed to achieve. The weight of evidence eventually forced Crawford's attorneys to abandon their defensive strategy and begin negotiating plea agreements that would minimize their client's exposure to federal prosecution. The man who'd seemed so confident that morning now sat silent, while his legal team discussed terms that would require full restitution to affected property owners and cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar schemes across the region. Agent Walsh's announcement of the preliminary findings carried implications that extended far beyond Eli's individual case. This investigation has revealed systematic corruption affecting rural communities across multiple states. Pinnacle Development Corporation and its associates face federal charges including conspiracy, fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The most satisfying moment came when the State Wildlife Commission formally announced that all challenges to Eli's educational permit were being withdrawn, with a written acknowledgement that the complaints had been manufactured rather than based on legitimate concerns about public safety or animal welfare. The Commission's statement included an unprecedented commendation for the quality of Eli's wildlife education program and Shadow's exceptional contribution to public understanding of wolf behavior. As the formal proceedings concluded, Eli found himself surrounded by neighbors who'd watched the day's revelations with growing amazement. Men who'd avoided him for months because of community pressure now approached to offer apologies and support. Marcus Whitfield, whose opposition had been motivated by Pinnacle's financial incentives rather than genuine concerns, shook Eli's hand with obvious shame. "I owe you an apology that's 3 years overdue," Whitfield said quietly. "That animal of yours has more character than most humans I know, including myself." The transformation in community attitudes was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the day's proceedings. Shadow's legal status was secure, Eli's property rights were protected, and the conspiracy that had threatened their future was permanently dismantled. But more importantly, the prejudice and fear that had isolated them for years had been replaced by understanding and respect. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, Eli felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what life felt like without it. Shadow greeted him with the enthusiastic affection she reserved for reunions after separation, her tail wagging with joy that seemed to capture the mood of the entire day. The battle that had defined 3 years of their lives was finally over, but the victory represented something larger than personal vindication. They'd proven that loyalty, patience, and quiet determination could triumph over corporate power and manufactured opposition. Most importantly, they demonstrated that unconventional relationships could survive and thrive when built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine affection. 2 years after the courthouse confrontation that changed everything, Eli Hargrove stood on his porch watching the sunrise paint the Sawtooth Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. At 58, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who discovered that standing up for what mattered most could transform not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. Shadow, now 5 years old and magnificent, in her prime, sat beside him with the patient alertness that had become her signature, watching the landscape they'd fought to preserve together. The Broken Arrow Ranch bore little resemblance to the struggling operation it had been 3 years. Earlier, federal restitution payments from Pinnacle Development Corporation had funded improvements that Eli had dreamed about for decades: new fencing, updated equipment, and a modern educational facility that hosted visiting school groups twice weekly. The wildlife education program had expanded beyond anything he'd originally envisioned, attracting visitors from across the region who came to learn about wolf behavior and the possibility of coexistence between humans and wild predators. The artifact that best represented their transformation sat on the kitchen table beside his father's old journal, a new leather-bound book that documented the evolution of the educational program and Shadow's remarkable development. The pages contained photographs of children meeting Shadow for the first time, testimonials from teachers who'd witnessed her gentle interactions with nervous students, and behavioral observations that had contributed to scientific understanding. Of wolf intelligence and adaptability, Dr. Patterson visited the ranch monthly now, not to document problems or address complaints, but to study Shadow's continued development and contribute to research that was revolutionizing approaches to wildlife. Education. Her success had inspired similar programs in other states, and Eli found himself consulting with ranchers and educators who wanted to develop their own innovative approaches to conservation education. You know, Dr. Patterson had told him during his most recent visit, Shadow's story is being taught in veterinary schools across the country. She's become a case study in the possibilities that emerge when people approach wildlife with patience and respect rather than fear and prejudice. The community transformation had been even more remarkable than Shadow's individual development. The ranchers who'd once viewed Eli as an obstacle to progress now sought his advice on sustainable land management and wildlife coexistence. Marcus Whitfield had become one of his strongest supporters, providing financial backing for educational program expansions and serving as an advocate with state officials who were developing new policies for human-wildlife interaction. Sarah Brennan's involvement in the program had evolved into a partnership that enriched both their lives while respecting the boundaries appropriate to their circumstances. Her marriage remained strong, but her work with the wildlife education program provided intellectual and emotional fulfillment that domestic life alone couldn't satisfy. Their friendship had deepened into something precious and lasting, built on shared values and mutual respect that transcended the romantic possibilities they'd once considered. "You've created something that will outlast both of us," Sarah told him during one of their planning sessions for the upcoming educational conference that would bring wildlife experts to Cedar Falls. Children who meet Shadow today will grow up with different attitudes toward wild animals and the people who choose to live alongside them. The legal victories that had saved the ranch and Shadow's program had implications extending far beyond their individual case. Federal investigations sparked by their evidence had dismantled similar corruption schemes across the American West, protecting dozens of ranch families from corporate manipulation and preserving rural communities that might otherwise have been sacrificed to development pressures. Jake Morrison had used his experience with the conspiracy to transform his own life, enrolling in college to study wildlife management and eventually becoming an advocate for ethical business practices in rural development. His testimony in subsequent federal cases had helped convict corporate executives and corrupt officials whose schemes had threatened communities across multiple states. The most satisfying aspect of their victory was watching Shadow's continued growth and development. She'd never lost her essential wildness, but she'd learned to channel her natural instincts in ways that served both her own needs and the educational purposes that had become her life's work. Her interactions with visiting children revealed intelligence and empathy that consistently amazed professional animal behaviorists, while her loyalty to Eli had deepened into a bond that exemplified the possibilities for trust between species. On quiet evenings, Eli often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The cruel joke that was supposed to destroy his dreams had instead provided him with the greatest gift of his life, a companion who taught him lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the kind of courage that emerges when someone has something worth protecting. The coffee tin, where he'd once saved money for a cattle dog, now held contributions from visitors who wanted to support the educational program's expansion. Children from across the region sent letters addressed to Shadow, sharing drawings and stories about their visits to the ranch. Teachers requested return visits, and wildlife biologists sought permission to study Shadow's behavior for research. That was expanding understanding of wolf intelligence and social adaptation. As the morning mist began to lift from the valley, revealing the familiar landscape that would always be home, Eli felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived. according to principles rather than convenience. The battles they'd fought had been difficult, but they'd proven that ordinary people could triumph over extraordinary challenges when they refused to surrender their values to expedience. Shadow stirred beside him, rising to begin their morning rounds of the property she'd learned to consider her territory. Their partnership had evolved beyond anything either species might have expected, but it worked because it was built on mutual respect, patient understanding, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be purchased or manufactured. Walking across the land his grandfather had claimed and his father had preserved, with Shadow moving silently beside him like a living shadow, Eli understood that some gifts come disguised as hardships, and some friendships transcend the boundaries that separate different worlds. Every man deserves at least one true friend who believes in him when the whole world has given up. And for Eli Hargrove, that friend had come with 4 paws, fierce yellow eyes, and a loyalty that had proven stronger than fear, prejudice, or corporate greed.